Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 in AP English and our World of Ideas lectures. This is lecture number 12, Simone de Beauvoir's Second Sex, out of the Unit 2 or Part 2 over justice. This is one of the most important single pieces of writing that will begin the conversation in the middle of the 20th century that has, of course, continued into the 21st century about the role and status of women as it relates to men and, of course, the history of the world. Now, just to remind where we've been, and our assumptions here in a second we'll say out loud, is that you've been following our early conversations at learnstrong.net in the AP folder, the World of Ideas folder. We've worked with Douglas's narrative, we've worked with Thoreau's civil disobedience, and we've worked with Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail, each in their own way discussing or concerning themselves with issues of justice and more particularly injustice. Now we turn to another perspective on justice and injustice, this one having to do with, of course, the great debate about the treatment of women by men and, of course, the treatment of men by women. And to that degree, we'll come back to a mantra that we've often used in 303. Think of it this way. If we are, in fact, the stories that we tell, the stories we retell, the stories that we accept, and the stories we reject, then Beauvoir's essay, her book, Second Sex, we'll be reading a part of that book, has to be considered one of the greats of all time. Now, as I begin this lecture, I want to pay some special tribute. Guys, so much of the stuff that I have to say, I would say almost all of the stuff that I have to say, is the product of tremendous help and brilliant minds that have shared ideas with me through my career. And I want to now pay special tribute to the great Barbara DeBernard, whose lectures I sat in at the University of Nebraska for a brief spell in our feminist studies together. And I just want to say a special thanks to her for enlightening me, especially as it relates to theorists like Beauvoir and others as well. And being the father of two daughters, no question, this topic is central in my own life, as I think it should be central in the lives of all men. As we turn now to this topic, let's begin with a few assumptions. The first is that, as I've already said, you've been with us through the earlier lectures of the World of Ideas lectures 1 through 11. If you haven't been a part of those, then I very much recommend that you pay attention to those at learnstrong.net, because I'm going to draw information from those lectures. Also, I'm going ahead and assuming that you are already familiar with our comments on Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, and more particularly the Wife of Bath's prologue and tale, especially our conversations there as it relates to this notion of the attack on the patriarchy, as we sometimes will refer to it, in Chaucer's special attacks on the patriarchy in Canterbury Tales. My assumption is you've already been with us for those conversations, as well as Chopin's Story of an Hour in the junior folder on learnstrong.net. And our comments there, specifically to feminism as it relates to early theorists in the 20th century in the American tradition. The other assumption for us is that you are familiar with our learning theory, that desire to connect new information to old information in meaningful ways, especially through our reading, our active reading, our annotative process. Remember, we always try to answer 3 guiding questions at level 1. What does the text say? Reminding you again that you're going to summarize each of the paragraphs in this essay to try to, at level 1, just paraphrase what it is that's being said. At level 2, we ask the question, what does the text mean to themes, messages, and we also, remember, take into consideration our big 5, as we refer to them in 303. That is to say, what does this text have to say about epistemology, what one can know, ontology, who one is, psychology, the study of the individual mind, sociology, this will be important for this reading, the study of the group collective mind, and then finally, theodicy, the existence of pain and suffering in the world, and what are we going to do about that? At 2B, we'll get to it in a moment again, we always concentrate on rhetoric and the rhetorical techniques that are being utilized. At level 3, we ask in our annotative process, how can I relate to this information in some meaningful way? At 3A, how can I relate to other texts and to other titles that we have already studied or that we might soon study? And then finally, and most importantly in our learning theory, how can I relate to this information personally. We live in a time now, I think this has been for some time now, where topics such as this one regarding issues of gender and sexuality and gender identity immediately become a place where all kinds of major wars happen. And no longer is there discourse or dialogue, which, of course, in 303 we consider to be a tragedy of all tragedies, because if we're learning to do anything, and I hope we are, it is that we're able to engage ideas, even ideas that we don't fully agree with, or maybe we don't completely comprehend, might be even a better way to say it. So as we move into this, our final assumption is that you're going to have read this material on your own, and then you'll come to our conversation here to maybe help you out a bit. Let's do a brief biography of Beauvoir. Her dates, 1908 to 1986. She is an important post-World War II French intellectual. She is a friend and pal of Jean-Paul Sartre. His dates, 1905 to 1980. You'll remember our conversations with Sartre regarding texts like No Exit or The Flies. There's been a lot of debate about that relationship between Jean-Paul Sartre and Beauvoir, and we're not going to get into that conversation or that debate here. But there have been a number of people that have pointed out that that was a very complicated relationship. I'll let you do your own research there. Now, Beauvoir's best-known work, not her only one, but certainly her best-known work, is called The Second Sex, published in 1949 in French and then in 1953 in English. And right away it became, as Jacobus will call it, a beacon for the feminist movement. Now, when we use this term feminist, we have to be very, very conscious of the way we use our language. Go back to our lecture on Chaucer's The Wife of Bath and remind ourselves that we began, and we started this conversation when we were in our Plato discussion in Republic Book 5, or even earlier, that when we are looking at the status of women as it relates to men, we follow that notion that Aristotle helped to create, that notion of the patriarchy, that saw gods at the top of our little apex of a triangle, men below the gods, and then women below men. And remember, Aristotle argued this was an organic view of the world and of nature. Organic meaning teleology. It is what it is. And I think even you'll maybe remember in our debate, our discussion of this topic, that if I were to look out in the courtyard there at Ruthie's tree and start screaming at that tree that I wanted it to turn from the tree that it is into a Christmas tree, one or two of you would point out, well, that's insane, because that tree's nature is to look the way that it is and not as a Christmas tree. Well, no, I want it to change. No, you don't understand. It cannot change. This is what we mean by organic, and this is the view that Aristotle had, that men tell women what to do and women have to get right with it. Now, that idea of the patriarchy, if it is to be challenged at all, that's what we mean by feminism, and Beauvoir is definitely going to do this in Second Sex, no question about it. Think of it this way. In France, women didn't have the right to vote until 1945. I mean, think about that. In Second Sex, then, Beauvoir is going to argue that women are in large measure seen as the other, and to that degree alienated. They're not a part of the world of men, and Beauvoir has serious problems with this. She says, interestingly, she argues that a woman is not actually born a woman. A person is not actually born a woman, right? She makes herself a woman through social conventions that help to shape gender. Now, what's fascinating about reading Beauvoir from the 1950s is that now as we approach almost 100 years later, these topics have become parlance in normal everyday culture. But when Beauvoir was writing this stuff, this was radical stuff, no question about it. Now we're going to have a cutting here, translated by H.M. partially, and this one is going to outline the history of the roles of women. And I'm just with you at the end of Jacobus's introductory comments on page 175. Just read with me the last couple of paragraphs. Beauvoir, he says, has drawn criticism for her description of women's behavior. She was accused by writers such as the poet Stevie Smith, not waving but drowning Stevie Smith, you can go and take a look at our comments on that in Learn Strong, of standing aside from the mass of women as if she were in a special separate category. Some readers and close friends felt that a relationship with Sartre, in which they saw her treated as an absolute equal intellectually, gave her a distorted view of the nature of women's subjugation and gave her writing a cool, overly reserved intellectual quality. We're going to see some of that here in a moment as well, right? But Just backtrack with me for just a second and go to page 174, and let's just take a look at what specifically it is that we'll be looking at in this cutting. Beauvoir concentrates, I'm now in the last paragraph of 174, Beauvoir concentrates on the history of women since the French Revolution, demonstrating that although social circumstances changed dramatically in France after 1789, the lot of women remained much the same. Her review of the condition of women preceded most other important feminist writings of the second half of the 20th century, and many of its concerns anticipate issues that have remained constant in feminist writing, such as equal pay for equal work. The question of justice for women is implicit in every line of this discussion. Beauvoir does not discuss how women will achieve justice, but rather reminds us that men will not grant women justice until it is in men's interest to do so. Again, that relinquishing of power conversation that we had in earlier discussions specific to Douglas and Thoreau and Martin Luther King Jr. Now let's comment for a few moments on the rhetorical techniques on page 174 and 175. We were headed in that direction a second ago. Before we finish that reading, the last two paragraphs though, let's just take a look at what Jacobus wants us to focus on. Simple, straightforward, calm, reasonable, direct style. Put that in your notes. Definitely argumentative, attempting to persuade us as readers that women have been treated unfairly, and to that degree, not just men but women as well are the intended audience here, right? Go back to our comments on Chopin's Story of an Hour and that idea that marriage is in many ways a prison for women, but women do not understand or recognize that. We think of Ibsen's Dollhouse as another classic example of this, as well as Glaspell's Trifles, a text that we study in AP. Of course, then the argument here is that marriage can be seen as a form of slavery, and to that degree we'll be thinking about Douglas. Just to return now to finish on page 175, this piece is reserved, the last paragraph. Beauvoir makes no effort to appeal to our emotions by raging against the oppression of men or by offering us a case study of female suffering. Her careful balancing of detail and fact, however, ultimately makes a powerful and unassailable case. Even her unexpected pairing of free love and adultery in paragraph number 3 demonstrates a form of injustice and the manner in which women have become accustomed to its presence in everyday life. Beauvoir's rational tone, put that in your notes, rational tone throughout the essay is one of the rhetorical hallmarks of the second sex and has established it as a seminal text. Let's turn now to the text itself, do a quick review at level 1 before we jump into our conversations at level 2 and 3. Let's begin first of all in paragraph 1, where, she will argue, the destiny of women has always been controlled by men. Whatever success women have achieved in worldly affairs has been achieved in terms defined by men. I'm on page 176 just to pick up. She says it this way: men have always held the lot of woman in their hands, and they've determined what it should be, not according to her interests, but rather with regard to their own projects, their fears, their needs. When they revered the goddess mother, it was because they feared nature. When the bronze tool allowed them to face nature boldly, they instituted the patriarch. Then it became the conflict between family and state that defined woman's status. The Christian's attitude toward God, the world, and his own flesh was reflected in the situation to which he consigned her. What was called in the Middle Ages the quarrel of women, quote unquote, was a quarrel between clerics and laymen over marriage and celibacy. It was the social regime founded on private property that entailed the guardianship of the married woman. And it is the technological evolution accomplished by men that has emancipated the women of today. It was a transformation in masculine ethics that brought about a reduction in family size through birth control and partially freed women from bondage to maternity. Feminism itself was never an autonomous movement. It was in part an instrument in the hands of politicians, in part an epiphenomenon reflecting a deeper social drama. She continues in paragraph 2 to say, historically, when granted social status, women have been denied legal rights, and when they enjoyed rights equal to those of men, they've been excluded from meaningful participation in society. In paragraph 3, she says, caught in this opposition between concrete social customs and theoretical legal rights, women have achieved greatness only in rare circumstances where gender didn't matter. For example, as sovereigns or as saints. We think about, of course, Queen Elizabeth. Paragraph 4, she begins this argument that because of their subservient position, women in general play no more than a negative or indirect role in political life, true control of the world has always been in the hands of men. Go over to page 178 just to pick this up. Men are glad, she says, to exaggerate the extent of these influences when they wish to convince woman that she has chosen the better part. But as a matter of fact, feminine voices are silent when it comes to concrete action. They've been able to stir up wars, we think of Helen, not to propose battle tactics. They've directed politics, hardly more than in the degree that politics is reduced to intrigue. The true control of the world has never been in the hands of women. They have not brought their influence to bear upon technique or economy. They have not made or unmade states. They have not discovered new worlds. In the 1950s, this is, of course, a clarion call. When we read this today, we look back and we say, has anything changed since this was written? And clearly we have to say, absolutely it has. In large measure, we would say, to Beauvoir. Paragraph 5, women generally exist on the margins of history, and this will be her historical argument and analysis now. Those who achieve heroic status are oddities, better known for their unusual fates than for the importance of their actions. On page 179 in paragraph number 5, the great man springs from the masses and is propelled onward by circumstances. The masses of women are on the margin of history, and circumstances are an obstacle for each individual, not a springboard. In order to change the face of the world, it is first necessary to be firmly anchored in it. But the women who are firmly rooted in society are those who are in subjugation to it, unless designated for action by divine authority. We think of Joan of Arc, for example. And then they have shown themselves to be as capable as men. The ambitious woman and the heroine are strange monsters, a famous line from Second Sex. In paragraph 6, she argues women have managed to assert themselves with considerable success in the domain of culture, but however great their collective role in this domain, the contributions of individual women have been less significant. Again, it is the marginal situation of women in the world that prevents them from attaining genius. Paragraphs 7 and 8 we'll see as a unit. The fact that a few women have achieved greatness does not counterbalance or excuse the subjugation of women as a whole. Today, many women demand rights and opportunities equal to those of men, but true equality between the sexes, despite some gains, still, she argues, does not exist. Paragraph number 8 is worth our time. The wish, she says, this wish is on the way to fulfillment, but the period in which we live is a period of transition. Again, the 1950s. This world, which has always belonged to the men, is still in their hands. The institutions and the virtues of the patriarchal civilization still survive in large part. Abstract rights are far from being completely granted everywhere to women. In Switzerland, they did not yet vote. They do not yet vote. In France, the law of 1942 maintains an attenuated form, the privileges of the husband. And abstract rights, as I have been saying, have never sufficed to assure to woman a definite hold on the world. True equality between the two sexes does not exist even today. I mean, you can't get a more, rhetorically speaking, a more declarative statement than that. Paragraph 9, she argues about marriage. Marriage places greater burdens on women than on men, making it more difficult for wives than for husbands to reconcile their domestic roles with their roles as workers. In paragraph 10, she says this difficulty is seen in the lives of French peasant women who are burdened with heavy domestic duties as well as field work. It's a compelling argument. In paragraphs 11, 12, she argues business women and female employees occupy a privileged position legally, socially. They have relatively few difficulties combining household and domestic duties. Women workers and professionals, on the other hand, face great difficulties. In paragraph 13, she argues women who seek independence through work have fewer opportunities than do their male counterparts. Again, this will be an argument for us today as we read an essay like this. Is this still true? By paragraph 14, we then are heading towards the end of this cutting. Paragraph 14, while more possibilities are now open for women, society still regards marriage as the highest calling because girls are taught to view marriage as a means of social and economic advancement. They often are less prepared to succeed professionally than their brothers are. I'll just jump over to page 184, and we're working now in paragraph 14. And what we read here will remind us really about Virginia Woolf's classic Shakespeare's Sister. You can go to learnstrong.net and see our comments there. The argument that Woolf will make is, what if Shakespeare had had a sister who was every bit as genius as William, and even more so? Would she have had a chance to, to write the great texts? This is the way Beauvoir says it. Parents still raise their daughters with a view to marriage rather than to furthering her personal development. She sees so many advantages in it that she herself wishes for it. The result is that she is often less specially trained, less solidly grounded than her brothers. She is less deeply involved in her profession. In this way, she dooms herself to remain in its lower levels, to be inferior, and the vicious circle is formed. This professional inferiority reinforces her desire to find a husband. Paragraph 15, to finish the essay, she says, for many female employees, work is a drudgery with few compensating rewards. Society holds out marriage as an escape from this drudgery, but women today, having achieved self-awareness, are loath to accept domestic subjugation. Women laborers are thus caught between the drudgery of unfulfilling work and the largely illusory hope of escape through marriage. To finish now, paragraph 16, she says it this way: the privileged place held by men in economic life, their social usefulness, the prestige of marriage, the value of masculine backing, all this makes women wish ardently to please men. Women are still, for the most part, in a state of subjugation. It follows that woman sees herself and makes her choices not in accordance with her true nature itself, but as a man defines her. Well, this is, of course, compelling ideas. Let's now turn to level 2 and 3 to finish. At level 2, our big 5. As we have said about every one of the texts that we've studied, we've asked 5 questions. What does the text say about epistemology? Well, notice that knowledge, that notion of what one can know, epistemology. Notice here, she will argue that the patriarchy has held a pretty quasi-absolutist position epistemologically. That is to say, men are right and tell women what to do. The argument that she seems to be making is what we